Well, it's about time for us to get started. And if you want to take your Bibles and you can turn to Mark 9. Mark 9 will be where we look for the time being. And you could also look at Matthew 17. We will have to go back to Matthew 17 near the end of our class for one last little section. But we'll take the time to look at Mark 9's account today. So if you're visiting with us, we are studying the life of Christ right now in our broader study of the Bible story. That's true whether you're visiting with us or not. It's true for you too. We're studying the big picture of the Bible, and we're studying the life of Christ. And we've worked through the periods of the life of Christ. Brother Waldron split it into 8 periods. I don't know if he was the original one to do that, but he split into 8 periods. And we've looked at the first 4 last quarter: preparation, beginning ministry, and Galilean ministry. And now we're in a period called the retirements. What do we mean by retirements? He's withdrawing, right? He's not giving up his job. He's not quitting at age 65. He is just withdrawing from the people. And really it seems that the intention here is to focus on the disciples, the apostles who are closest to him. We're about a year out probably from his crucifixion, and we're looking toward that, and Jesus is going to be more clear about that in some of these periods of time. We are looking in this period that we've counted 4 periods of withdrawal, 4 retirement periods, and this is the 4th retirement where Jesus withdraws from the crowd. Now, of course, the crowds keep flocking to him because he performs the miracles. But he is spending this time withdrawing from them in several different ways. Now, we left off last time, and does anybody remember the location that we left off last time? Where were Jesus and the disciples last time? Good guess. Decapolis is a good guess. Not too far off. So when Jesus, the last thing we looked at was in Matthew 16, and Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." Where does all that happen? Do you remember? Caesarea Philippi. That's right. So it's right here on the larger map, and then we come right here. This is Caesarea Philippi, zoomed in a little bit. So we made our way through chapter 16, and the first thing we've got is this is the first time that Jesus speaks, at least as recorded, very clearly about his coming death, telling the disciples exactly what's happening. How does Peter react to that? He pushes back against it, says that will never happen. Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you don't have your mind on man's interest or on God's interest, you have it on man's interest." And he says, in fact, if you're going to be my disciple, you've got to take up your cross and follow me. Now, in all of that, in Mark's account, we come from chapter 8, verse 27, and it's that last conversation at Caesarea Philippi. You see that there in verse 27. And then you come down to verse 38, and he says, "Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And I think really the paragraph should just continue. It does continue. If depending on how your Bible is broken up, it may connect chapter 9, verse 1 more with chapter 8. Jesus was saying to them, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God come in power." All right, so that's where we left off. Jesus speaks clearly about who he is, what he has come to do, and then he speaks clearly about what the call is to us and why it's so significant that we accept it. All right? Then we come to Mark 9 or Matthew 17, verse 1 in preparation for what we're going to talk about tonight. Anything we need to say in leading up to that? Any questions or comments about what we talked about last time in leading into all of this? Okay, so the reason I said all that about being in Caesarea Philippi is in chapter 9 and verse 2, the text says that 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them up on a high mountain alone by themselves. We'll talk more about that in just a second. The mountain is never identified. We don't know the name of the mountain, but there have been a lot of people. I forgot the connector for my clicker, so I may have to get up a couple of times. The idea is potentially that it was at Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon, Caesarea Philippi sits right at the foot of Mount Hermon. And it would definitely qualify as a high mountain because it's the highest mountain in the region. And so there's lots of people just putting the pieces together who have suggested that perhaps Mount Hermon was the place where the transfiguration that we're going to talk about in just a minute is going to happen. Let me note this. In Mark 9, verse 2, it says that it was 6 days later. And then, let's see, back in Matthew 17, it says 6 days later. And I believe Luke, am I wrong about this? In Luke 9, that it says about 8 days later. Is that right? Trying to get all my Gospels harmonized here. In Luke 9, yeah, it happened some 8 days after these words. What's going on there? 6 days, and 8 days. And a skeptic would point to this and say, look, they don't even know what they're doing here. Yeah, so Luke does say about 8 days. That's right. And so what do you think could be at work there? Is there a possible explanation? I would say that it's very possible that Luke may be counting the day of and the day that it happened. And it could be that Matthew's counting the interim period. We don't know the exact explanation, but if there's a reasonable explanation for it, then it's not a contradiction. Now, Luke does say about 8 days, and Matthew and Mark do say 6 days, but it may just be a different reckoning of the days. And I think they're both saying that the transfiguration happens on the same day, but I just want you to be prepared for that if somebody ever brings up that that's a contradiction in the life of Jesus. Okay, anything else? Anything you want to read for us? You can go maybe all the way down to verse 8 of Mark 9. So
it says, and after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, brought them into a high mountain apart from themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his garments became glistening, exceedingly white, so as no fuller on earth could whiten them. And there appeared unto him Elijah and Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. For he knew not what to answer, for they became sore afraid. And there came a cloud overshadowing them, and there came a voice out of the cloud, This is my beloved Son, hear ye him. And suddenly looking around about, they saw no one anymore, save Jesus only with themselves. So the first thing which I may have known this, I just never really thought about it, the difference in being transformed and being transfigured. And as I was studying this, the definitions popped up, and to be transformed means to be changed, but the change can be good or bad. To be transfigured means to become more beautiful as to receive glory. So as we go through this, it helped me to remember that Jesus is not transformed, he's transfigured so that he can receive the glory that he is due. So I found that interesting, the difference there.
Yeah, it's an interesting word, and I don't know if this is the word they used, but the word transfigured there, it's the word by which we get the word metamorphosis. We get that word from there. So when you talk about a butterfly changing from a caterpillar to a butterfly, that's the word that's being used here. And so I think what you've got happening here is a revealing of who he truly is, but it is a positively transformative process. But yes, transfiguration is. I think this word is used in other places, but this is a special way in which it's used with regard to Jesus.
So then you got in verse 4, Elijah and Moses and Jesus sitting here talking, and just think of the greatness in that conversation. To sit there, especially as Peter, James, and John, and to see Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah, and we'll see Peter's response here, just how powerful that would be just to be in that group of men. And then Peter realizes real quick, Lord, this is where we need to be. He wanted to stay there. And, one thing that I thought of in just this brief time, I don't know how long this conversation took place, but I wouldn't think it took place very long. But in this brief time, Peter realizes, hey, this is where I want to be. This is where we need to be, in the presence of Jesus as he's being glorified, in the presence of Moses, the presence of Elijah, that he wanted to build tabernacles. He wanted to stay in that moment. So that makes me, and it should make you, want to do everything we can do to get to that same place where we can spend eternity with Christ and his glory and to be around these great people. So if Peter can realize that in just a brief time of this conversation, it should make us want to do the same, to figure out what we must do to be found faithful and spend eternity in this same presence that he's at.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me. Anybody note, remember if you read ahead or something, what Luke says they were talking about, what their conversation was talking about? His departure. And the word that's used there is his exodus. His exodus. It's interesting to think about that with Moses and Elijah being the ones to come and talk to Jesus. So I think there's several things going on with Moses and Elijah as people. But as far as people who have an opportunity to talk about exoduses, I think they would be pretty compelling conversation partners in that, right? So first of all, Moses and the Exodus, right, coming out of Egypt. But I would say even more so his death and thinking about that departure. And it was significant death in that he concludes his teaching, goes up on the mountain, and then he's gone, don't know where he's buried. And I think Elijah might even have a better story of Exodus when he's caught up in the whirlwind and is removed from the earth. So it's interesting that they are the ones with compelling departure stories, or they are talking to Jesus about the departure. But I wonder if the significance of this is not about the nature of the departure, but about its meaning. And when you think about Moses and Elijah, what would they stand for in your mind? What would they represent to you? What about Moses? What would he stand for? Yeah, the law, right? I mean, it's called the law of Moses a good bit, right? And so he would have been the great law giver, at least the great law transmitter. And so here is probably, if you're thinking about your Old Testament, kind of the premier person in that would be Moses writing that down. And then where is Elijah in all of that? What would you think about him? A reformation and prophecy is where I would put him. He's kind of at the head. Now, he was not the first prophet, but when we think about this long line of prophets that come like during the period of the divided kingdom, Elijah is kind of in a premium spot. We get a lot more material on him than we do a lot of the prophets. And it seems to be, there's a reference in Zechariah about the clothing of a prophet, and it seems that the prophets were mimicking, they were dressing like Elijah. And so like if you wanted to be a prophet, you dressed like Elijah, and that gave everybody a sense that you were a prophet. It was kind of like a doctor putting on a lab coat. You know, it just had that essence. And if you wanted to be a prophet, you needed to look like Elijah. He was the typical one. So I don't think it would be inappropriate to think about Moses and Elijah kind of standing for the law and the prophets. And here they are having a conversation about Jesus' departure, about Jesus' Exodus. Now, the key question for me is a question that I don't think I'll get an answer this side of eternity, is how Peter, James, and John knew that's who these people were. Maybe in the conversation, yeah, Mr. Creighton said name tags, yeah, but it wouldn't help me any because they were probably written in Hebrew, but that's all right. But maybe in the conversation that Peter, James, and John are able to pick up on that, or maybe it's just revealed to them in some way that we don't have identified here. And so in this situation, if you are Peter, James, and John, this is like Mr. Mitchell was saying, this is a grand situation to have Moses and Elijah there, and then Jesus transfigured before them. And what's going on in this transfiguration? How would you explain what's happening here? What do we see in this? I think, what'd you say? Yeah, of Jesus. Yeah, I think we're seeing His glory. I think we're seeing the glory of God in this. And what I want you to see in this is that Jesus has talked about what's coming in the future, His death and His resurrection, but He is in a status of glory now, right? At this moment, in the middle of His ministry, He is already, and this is a revelation of that glory. Can we flip over to 2 Peter? And there's more to say. We'll come back to 2 Peter. You might put a marker there. But this is in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 16. And Peter is making the case. He's reminding the people that he's writing to of some things they need to know, especially in preparation of him dying and being gone. And he says in verse 16, we did not make known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, following cleverly devised myths, but being eyewitnesses of his majesty. Does anybody have a different word than majesty? That's probably eyewitnesses of his majesty. Is that right? Okay. For when he received honor and glory from the Father, such an utterance as this was made to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. Now, we can come back to that in a minute, but he says we saw his majesty revealed there on the mountain. Now, his majesty is revealed. His clothes are whiter than any laundromat in Franklin County could make them, at least. And he's in this glory, and Peter, James, and John are able to see him with Moses and Elijah, an incredible scene. Yes, sir, Mr. Creighton.
6 days, 8 days. Prior to this, they were still looking at this human majesty.
Yes.
And now they were revealed to them his glorious majesty, the true majesty that they should receive.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the purpose of this, but I see that being a meaning focus to an end.
Yes, sir. I think that's super helpful. And I also think its placement, I think the placement is because of the chronology, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's all made right after this great confession, right? So they have not seen this unveiling of his glory in this way yet. And yet Peter and the other apostles, I think, would be on the same page with him, are brought to the confession that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Peter says that, and then he gets a little bit of a picture of what that means, what that reveals. All right, anybody else so far? We got a lot more to talk about, but okay. So what's Peter's suggestion? Let's build some tabernacles, right? Some tents, some dwelling places. Now, why? He says because it's good for us to be here. And so why would he want tabernacles? And he only says 3, right? He doesn't say 6, so it's not like he's necessarily interested in Peter, James, and John staying there permanently, but he wants Jesus, Moses, and Elijah to all have a place. Why? He wants to show them all honor. That's exactly right. I think in this, Peter says we have great men who have been given lots of revelation from God, and we want to hear from them, right? That's a pretty good attitude to have. These are the guys who wrote it down. I saw a meme, a cartoon the other day, and it was like a lunchroom, and it was like 12 different tables, and you got to pick which lunchroom table you sat at, and like Mary was at one, Abraham was at another one, Paul, and it's like, which one would you choose? And like Peter and James and John are like, we've got 3, right? We got Moses, Jesus, and Elijah here. It seems to me that I think he's trying to honor Jesus in what he's saying. I think he's saying, Jesus, I'm putting you on the same level as Moses and Elijah, and I want to listen to all 3 of you. You know, if you mention my name in the same sentence as some great people, I would be honored about that. But what Peter's doing is I think he's saying, you belong in the same level as Moses and Elijah, and we want you to stay too in one of these tabernacles because we want to hear from the 3 of y'all. Y'all are great revelators of God's will. All right? That seems fair to say that that's what's going on, right? And what happens? God speaks. The Father speaks. And what does he say? Yeah. He says, this is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear ye him. So it was not inappropriate for Peter to be interested in the words of Moses and Elijah. The problem is when he put Jesus' words just at their level. It was all right to sit there and listen to the conversation they were having. God made that happen, right? The conversation wasn't the problem. Listening to Moses and Elijah wasn't the problem. The problem was saying is that Jesus is just on their level when you need to hear him, especially. You need to listen to him, especially. You have anything you want to throw in on that? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
What kind of cloud do you think this is? Do you think this is an ominous cloud? Do you think it's a cloud that
Well, my picture, it looks kind of like a pretty cloud, but I didn't draw that. So I don't know. What do you? They're scared, right? So maybe it is more ominous than the picture. Thunderings and lightnings. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Well, yeah. So let me mention this. Whether I don't know about the cloud, but let me say this. So in Mark's account, it says, verse 6, that Peter said this. Anybody say the reason why, verse 6, why Peter said it like this? He was scared. Mine says he didn't know how to answer because he became terrified. So he was scared and didn't know what he should have said, so he said. And it's like, that's not a good way of saying things. Now, I think that probably is what we do when we don't know what to say. We say the first thing that comes to mind, and that's probably not an ideal situation. But it's interesting, in Luke 9 and verse 32, it says, when Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. So they're tired, and so Peter is maybe not in his best thinking process here when he says this. But then the voice says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. And it's interesting in 2 Peter chapter 3, as I made mention of a second ago, as Peter kind of concludes that little paragraph, and he says, we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. They heard it. They were eyewitnesses. That left an impression on Peter, so that decades later, when he's writing to people and says, I want you to know that the things I'm writing weren't myths, that they weren't fairy tales, that they were real, he references this occasion where he heard the voice. That left an impression on Peter's heart, didn't it? Okay. All right. Anything else that you want to say about that? No. Okay. When they look up, who's there? Jesus. Yeah, it's just Jesus. And I wonder if this is kind of a picture of Hebrews chapter 1, God who at sundry times and in divers manners has spoken to us, and God who at sundry times has spoken to us in divers manners, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son.
I think that's the whole, like you said, Moses being the law, Elijah being the prophets. When it's all said and done, only Jesus remains.
That's right.
Because he's the one that's going to put to death the law, fulfill the prophecy, and he's the one that's going to be exalted in glory.
That's right. And the thing that I want to think about here is, I don't think that this picture is to tell us that the law and the prophets are irrelevant or that they are unimportant. I think the picture here is to say they were pointing to Jesus. They did their job. So Romans 10 verse 4 says the end of the law is Christ. I think that's the idea of the goal, the outcome of the law is Christ. Jesus will continue to teach through the scriptures, especially I think about Luke 24, where he says this is the stuff that the law and the prophets were talking about when it came to him. So it's not that there's no benefit to them for us. It's not that it wouldn't be beneficial for Peter to listen to Moses and Elijah. We spend quite a lot of time thinking about what Moses and Elijah says. But what we need to see is that without Jesus, Moses and Elijah are empty.
Well, there's a reason that as it's going through this, that it says his garments, not theirs.
Yeah, not theirs. That's exactly right.
That he was glistening, that he was white, he was glorified, not all three of them. It doesn't mention that.
That's right. That's right. And so just let me throw this in there. So John 1 and says, and the Word became flesh, and we beheld his glory. Glory is of the only begotten of the Father. Now, if I'm John, right, who was here, and I'm writing my gospel account, and I say, and I got to behold his glory, glories of the only begotten of the Father, I think this would be in my account. And John's the only one that doesn't include it. The only one of these three men who wrote a gospel account doesn't include this moment. And I think what John is saying is, yes, that was a moment of glory being revealed, but that wasn't how his glory was revealed for the most part. His glory was revealed most part through his words and his works, his teachings and his miracles and things like that. But it is interesting, John, who was an eyewitness here, doesn't record that part in his gospel account, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. Okay, anything else in those verses? Okay, let's look at verses 9 through 13. As they were coming down from the mountain, He gave them orders not to recount to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. And they seized upon that statement, arguing with one another what rising from the dead meant. And they began asking him, saying, why is it that the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he said to them, Elijah does come first and restore all things, and yet how is it written of the Son of Man that he will suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has indeed come, and they did to him whatever they wished, just as it is written of him. So this brings us to a set of questions about Elijah, and I'm just going to put all this on the screen at one time if I can. There had been the very end of the Old Testament, Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, says that God is going to send Elijah. Now, who do the religious teachers think might be the fulfillment of that promise? They think John. Now, why would look at John 1 and verse 21. And I say this for a reason, and you know the reason, but I just want to make sure we're clear here. So in John 1 and verse 21, they are asking him a series of questions about who he is, whether or not he's the Christ. And then in verse 21, they asked him, what then are you, Elijah? And what does he say? I am not. All right. So is John Elijah? No. All right. Well, flip back to the book of Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. In Luke chapter 1, and this is in verse 17, and this is the word of the angel Gabriel to Zechariah about the son that's about to be born. And look at verse 17. He will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children and the disobedient to the attitude of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So, the angel in Luke's account says that he is going to go in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Now, in Mark 9's account, we don't get a clear answer to the question. We get just kind of a general description that Elijah had. Now, you know why they would have that question, right? Because they just saw Elijah on the mountain. And they would have said, I thought he was supposed to come first. But then, this is in, I guess it's in Matthew's account. Matthew chapter 17. And they come down the mountain, and we have recorded the very same thing that's said in Mark. But look at verse 13 of Matthew 17. Then the disciples understood that when he talked about Elijah, he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. So it's interesting that we have these different passages. We got the promise that Elijah is going to come. And in his birth announcement, John is said to be the one who's going to come in the spirit and power of Elijah. But then in John 1, he denies being Elijah. But then in Matthew 17, Jesus says Elijah already did come, and he was talking about John the Baptist. That's a lot of yes and no's on the Elijah thing. I think what's happening is Jesus is saying Malachi 4 was talking about John. He is the Elijah that God promised. When John denies being Elijah, I think he's denying being the reincarnation of Elijah. I think he's denying being literally Elijah. I think that there were probably some people who, given the way that Elijah was carried off and didn't have a real death, I think there were probably people who thought Elijah himself was actually going to come back. And John the Baptist says, I'm not Elijah. And Jesus says, he is Elijah in the prophetic sense, in the sense that he would be the Elijah that was coming, that he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. Maybe we didn't have to spend that much time on all that, but it helps me to put all that together. Any comments on that? Any questions? Anything that you'd like to say? That's where my statement about comments and questions came from. That's what I do in Bible class. Any comments or questions? So, you have something, Austin?
I do. It's just slightly different. So, not exactly on that. I did, but here they're told not to tell anybody transfiguration, which is the same thing about the confession, right?
Yeah.
Don't tell anybody else what you just confessed. It's just interesting to me that you have, well, one, them, at least Peter, making that connection. Don't tell anybody. And then maybe more evidence of this and still don't tell anybody. I don't know. It's just interesting to me. Are they even allowed to tell the other apostles?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's saying, I'm not sure. This one is maybe one of the harder ones for me to explain about why not. Like when he says, "Don't tell people I'm the Christ," and then immediately we see that Peter has no idea what it means for him to be the Christ. I'm like, oh, I get that. When he's trying to get away from the crowds and he says, "Don't tell anybody about this miracle," I get that. This one is a more challenging one for me, but it does say until he's raised from the dead. And so maybe it's a place about where Jesus wants people's confidence to rest. And, you know, the other disciples will see it for themselves. I don't know, but that's a good question to raise.
And maybe it don't make sense to Peter until he sees the resurrection.
That's right.
And then it all, okay.
Yeah.
It all makes sense now.
Well, yeah, he doesn't even know what raised from the dead means, right? Like he has that question as they come down from the mountain. So, okay, very good. All right, so when they come down from the mountain, Mr. Mitchell, if you want to read for us from there and kind of take it as far as you'd like, starting about verse 14, I think.
When they came to the disciples, they saw a great multitude about them, the scribes questioning with them. Straightway all the multitude, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and running to him, saluted him. And he asked them, "What questions do you with them?" And one of the multitude answered, said, "Teacher, I brought to them my son, who hath a dumb spirit, and whosoever taketh him, it dasheth him down. He foameth and grindeth his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples, and they should cast it out, and they were not able to. And he answered them and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him unto me. And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tore him grievously, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. And he asked his father, How long time is it since he has come unto him? And he said, From a child. And oft times it hath cast him both into the fire and to the waters to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, If you can, all things are possible to him that believeth. Straightway the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. And when Jesus saw that the multitude came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I command thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. Having cried out and torn him much, he came out. The boy became as one dead, insomuch that he more part said, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, raised him up, and he arose. And when he was coming to the house, well, we'll stop there. At verse 27.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see as Peter, James, and John and Christ are coming down from the transfiguration, they see a multitude around the other disciples, and you know the crowd leaves them and comes towards Jesus to salute him. And you can kind of see Jesus as, thought of, what's going on here? Why is there a crowd? What are y'all questioning with? What's going on here? And so they had brought a child with a demon spirit, a dumb spirit, and the disciples couldn't cast him out. Anything on that?
Yeah. Do we want to go ahead and jump to the why they couldn't cast him out? I mean, that kind of brings in the end of it too, but I think we can kind of tie it together.
Yeah.
So we know that the disciples had been entrusted with the power to cast out demons. So I think it's Mark 6, right? Mark 6, and he sends out the 12. This is verse 7. He began sending them out in pairs and was giving them authority over the unclean spirits. And then in verse 13, and they were casting out many demons and were anointing with oil many sick people and healing them. So we know that the apostles had been given the power to cast out these unclean spirits. It was Peter, James, and John are up there on top of the hill, and the other apostles, there's 9 of them, I suspect, are down there, and they can't cast out the demon. What does Jesus say is the issue at work when he resolves this issue at the end of this account? What's the issue? Did we read that part?
No.
Oh, that's okay. Why don't we?
28.
Yeah, look at verse 28 and 29. They began questioning him privately. Why could we not cast it out? And Jesus said, "This kind cannot come out by anything but prayer." What do you think is going on there? Is it possible that they tried to cast out the demon without even praying about it? Without even reaching out to the Lord about it? Matthew's account, there's a textual question, but it says doesn't come out by fasting and prayer. I think we often see fasting connecting with prayer. So I think it's not just prayer, but it's a serious devotion to what's happening there. But regardless of the fasting part, because there's questions about the textual authenticity of that. Anyway, this idea that, is it possible, I'm just throwing this out there, is it possible that in this work of going out and casting demons out, that they had gotten to the point where they just go to do it and they don't even consult the Lord about it, that they don't pray? This is described by Jesus as being little faith. He calls them, in Mark's account, it says, "Oh, unbelieving generation." In Matthew's account, I think he says, "Oh, ye of little faith." So here are the disciples, the apostles, who have been entrusted with this power, and they demonstrate little faith. And I think that the context shows us that it's because they don't even petition the Lord in the appropriate way. They don't even come to God and ask for help in casting out this demon. I don't know why. I don't know what's happened. I don't know if they've just got used to the process, but I think that we see a lack of faith and a lack of reaching out to God on this account.
That's how I looked at it.
Yeah.
Maybe the power was in themselves, and they just forgot to depend on God in
Right.
the situation. Without prayer and stuff, that maybe it just become a point where they said it happens, and the reason why they had forgot about that it was God who was doing it.
Yeah. And Jesus seems to be frustrated with them, right? So when he says, "Oh, unbelieving generation, how long shall I put up with you?" I don't think he's talking to the crowd. I don't think he's talking to the Father that's bringing the Son. I think he's probably talking to the disciples who should be in a better place than this. It kind of sounds like the frustration that he had when they didn't understand what he's talking about with the unleavened, or with the bread, with the leaven. It's like, come on, guys, let's get on the same page here. And they're not there yet, even at this moment. With the Father? Okay, mine says, Jesus said to him, "If you can, ? All things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the boy's father cried out and was saying, "I do believe, help my unbelief." Yeah. Yeah, see, I think the father's question there is interesting. So it depends on how you punctuate verse 23. So the father comes in verse 22 describing the boy's condition and says, "If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And I don't know if Jesus is saying, "If you can," like questioning. And it may be that Jesus is saying, "If you can," right? It's not about me. It's about if you can believe. Because with faith, all things are possible. But I do like the Father's response. I do believe, help my unbelief. I think that's a helpful place to be. I have been in situations, I'll tell you over the last 2 years or whatever, I'll say, "I believe, help my unbelief." I am committed to these things as true. I believe them to be true, but I have a hard time putting all the pieces together right now and understanding how all this is working out. I do believe, help my unbelief. And I think the Father is saying, I think he has confidence that Jesus can do it, but I think he's already seen failure on the part of the disciples, and maybe there's a gap there. And Jesus, when he sees the crowd, he rebukes the unclean spirit and casts him out. And so Jesus does healing. But I think you're exactly right. I think there's a lot of conversations that we could have about faith in this situation. Maybe a lack of faith on the disciples, maybe a lack of faith on the Father, but with a recognition of that gap and trying to have more full belief in Jesus in this.
And that's how I read it when he says, if you can, like, you know I can.
Yeah, that's right. It's if you can. That's right. Yeah. And mine has it with a question mark. I think other translations do it with an exclamation point. If you can, or if you can. Like, is he questioning Jesus? And it may be that Jesus is questioning him, if he can believe. Now that's not the case every time. Like, the boy is not expressing any faith here. The boy is being tormented by this demon. I don't see him expressing faith at all. But it's more about, there's a different occasion. This is in Mark 1, where the leper comes to Jesus and he says, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." I think that's maybe what Jesus would have commended more as an approach. The leper didn't have any doubt about his ability, maybe a question about his willingness. And then Jesus says, "I am willing." And so that we see we see people who need Jesus approach him in a little bit of different ways. I don't think there's anything to lament about the way the Father approaches him, because he has faith, and he says, I see that I'm short where I need to be as well. Help me. Help my unbelief. He cries out to God about that. Okay, anything else on this account here? All right, very briefly, I'm just going to mention this, and then we'll move on to the last account. Jesus will speak plainly about his death, burial, and resurrection 3 times in the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we see this, we saw it last time in Matthew 16. Jesus, that's kind of the first time that he speaks with clarity. The second time is right here in verses 30 and through 32 of Mark 9. It's interesting, he says, verse 31, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise again 3 days later. Verse 32, but they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. So this is one of those situations where the disciples don't get it. They know they don't get it, but they're not pursuing the answer maybe as fully as they needed to. Okay. Anything you want to say about that? Any questions or comments just about that clear statement about his death, burial, and resurrection? We'll see another one. We won't see it in Matthew until Matthew chapter 20. So we won't see it in 18 and 19. We'll see it in chapter 20. So it'll be a little bit down the road.
Do you think they're afraid to ask about it because they just had 2 instances like we just talked about where they thought they understood what was going on?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because they didn't understand what he meant by raising of the dead, and here he mentions it again, and they don't understand again and don't ask for clarification again. So
They've just had the conversation of not being able to cast out the demons.
That's right. That's right.
Probably like, we're not going to push the
Yeah,
button.
they already have little faith, and if they ask this question, it's be like, you got little faith still, like get it together. But okay, let's go quickly. We've only got a few minutes to get this last account in. This is in Matthew chapter 17. And this is the account of the temple tax. And I'll read this real quick, and then I'll let you make comments on it first, if you don't mind. Now, when they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? And he said, yes. And when he came to the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect tolls or taxes? From their sons or from strangers? And when Peter said, from strangers, Jesus said to him, then the sons are exempt. However, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea and throw in a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a stater. Take that and give it to them for me and you. A stater that's a stater, that's mentioned there was a standard coin, about 4 days of a laborer's wages. So just if you want to know that. Okay. What do you want to share about that?
The main thing I draw from it, one, this tax for atonement or temple fee, he's asking if the children of the king have to pay the fee, why would he not have to pay this fee? Because this temple is God, so technically he's the Son of God, so he's not really having to pay this. But to avoid conflict and things, he has Peter to go and to pull this fish out. And one of the biggest things I took from that is, while Jesus, through his miracle, pays the debt, Peter still had to do work. He still had to go catch the fish. He had to do his part in this paying of the debt. Same thing for us today. Christ has paid our debt, but yet there's work that we must do. It's not just a free gift. It's not just something that, it is a gift, but there's work that we have to do. Just like Peter had to go catch the fish to receive his debt paid. Christ has paid our debt, but we have work to do also. Like a minute. So.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a statement about the identity of who Jesus is. So to be able to say, I don't have to pay the debt because I'm the Son of God, is a pretty powerful statement. Maybe it's a statement more to Peter than anybody else, because he's basically the only one who knows all the details of this conversation. Why did he pay it? So not be an offense. That's what he says. To not cause any need for stumbling. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put up, this is the last slide for tonight. These are questions. You can just look at those questions. These are things that I'm thinking about for Wednesday night. And so if you want to take a picture of that, or just kind of picture them in your mind. And we don't really answer these questions in class, but it helps us to kind of meditate on these and try to think about them as we read. Okay, thank y'all very much. Appreciate your good comments and attention.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.